Florida. And again, I'm joined by Dr. Jermaine Smith-Ball, President and CEO of the Urban League of Broward County, and Dr. Annette Moran, Associate Director of the FIU Metropolitan Center. We are grateful to all of you stakeholders in our community who are able to join us today. To our social media audience, thank you for joining us as well as we present for the first time two reports that offer a sobering reality of equity: the state of Black Broward and the state of Hispanic and Immigrant Broward. To offer context, let's start by defining equity. Equity is a state, quality, or ideal of being just, impartial, and fair. The concept of equity is synonymous of fairness and justice. According to the Race Matters Institute, the route to achieving equity will not be accomplished through treating everyone equally, rather by treating everyone equitably, or justly according to the circumstances. Well, this contrasts with the current state of affairs in Broward County, in which the person of color or ethnic group is more likely to live or be imprisoned, drop out of high school, be unemployed, lack access to safe, decent, and affordable housing. Both reports are tools to provide an analytical framework to advance racial equity in Broward County and measure the disparities that exist between racial and ethnic groups. This calls us, as stakeholders and community leaders, to urgent action. As we said earlier, we really believe we are equipped with reliable, accurate data and way better prepared to make informed decisions and plan for a more diverse, equitable, and inclusive community that will build upon our existing efforts to improve outcomes. This week is of great importance to Hispanic community of Florida. We celebrate 40 years of service. I'm extremely honored that I have been myself 20 years with the organization. And as Jermaine said before, I am one of those numbers. Hispanic community has witnessed racial and ethnic inequities and disparities in Broward County despite the fantastic work of programs and services offered by organizations like us and the Urban League of Broward County. What we have seen and experienced during the past 40 years is what really prompted Hispanic community and Urban League to get involved in research in this research study. These research findings are critical as we strategically plan the next 40 years of Hispanic community. I know that I speak for Jermaine as well when I say we have been eager to have this conversation regarding disparities while advancing equity in our community.
Well, thanks, Felipe. I'm just so thrilled to be able to be with you today as you celebrate as a new leader. So let's give Felipe love. You know, around this time, we want to also say thank you to the Jim Moran Foundation for generously investing in both the Urban League of Broward County and Hispanic Unity of Florida to examine and to bring to light these various disparities around and among Black and brown families. We also want to thank Dr. Murray and his research team at the Metropolitan Center at FIU for their extensive research and all the back and forth that we put you through as non-researchers to get us to this point. We thank you for offering your time, your talent, and your insight to making this possible in Broward County. For everyone else joining us today, we just want to let you know that the Broward County Equity Initiative presents a holistic, integrated analysis of the state of Broward County's Black, Hispanic, and immigrant populations and communities to determine the level of inequity and disparity that exists within our county. And as I shared earlier, let us be clear, this is not an organization. It is an opportunity where Hispanic Unity of Florida, the Urban League, and others choose, and it is a choice, to integrate racial equity and advocacy with other collective, collaborative networks. Dr. Murray, I'm sure that you will have the key findings from the report to share today. So I promise you, to the audience listening to us live on Facebook and to the audience here, it will not be death by data. I promise you that. He is going to give you an enlightened opportunity to understand what is in the reports that you can download from both our websites, and many of you have in front of you today. Dr. Murray?
Can anybody hear me without? Okay. Don't hear me. Yeah. Stereo. Well, thank you, Jermaine. Thank you, Philippe. And once again, thank you. This is really an opportunity that's quite momentous in terms of what both the Urban League and Hispanic community have accomplished with reports, and this is only the beginning. But as Jermaine said, what we try to do at the Metropolitan Center, and I think a lot of you are familiar with our work over the years, is we try to put words to data and a narrative to the research that we do, because it's really important when doing applied research that it makes sense to everyone. Everyone should be able to look at the data, look at the maps and all the way we display, and be able to use it, because ultimately we want to use this framework, this foundation of data analytics to be able to have these discussions that we're beginning with today. I'm going to go through some of these early slides fairly quickly because Jermaine, Philippe, and I covered some of these in terms of the purpose of the two reports and how they will provide the basis for the larger equity policy initiative moving forward. So that analytical framework is really what we want to focus on at this point. What does it all mean? Where does this take us? What's the path forward? These are all discussions that we begin today. The goals, the larger goals are really important because I think it's one of the media questions that were put to us this morning in terms of, where are we at and what do we need to accomplish in terms of this initiative. Well, the goals are really quite specific and they're very urgent. So we start with obviously creating the economic equity that is so lacking, because without the fundamentals in terms of economic equity, it's very, very difficult to take on a lot of these other issues, whether it be affordable housing, public health, public education. The economy is essential, and essentially the disparities and inequities that we found were really quite concerning. So we want to build wealth, but wealth comes with a lot of other things, a lot of fundamentals, starting with education and good health, a good living environment in terms of housing. We want to be able to begin to create real economies in our communities, in our communities of color. Not just jobs in and of themselves, but creating the entrepreneurial opportunities for small businesses, which comprise so much of the economic base of South Florida to begin with. So there's no reason why we can't see more opportunities developing in some of our Black and Hispanic communities, but also in our more distressed communities at large, many of which are, of course, communities of color. So we want to be able to think in terms of physical investment that has to take place in order for that to happen. A lot of these things are quite doable, but we have to be able to have these conversations in terms of what does that all mean? What does that mean in terms of capital investment? What does that mean in terms of infrastructure investment? What does that mean in terms of investment in public education, public health, things like that? The housing market, we could go on and on the rest of the morning about the housing situation, which you all know, but it's only gotten worse, obviously, for those who are renters, and the majority of Black and Hispanics in Broward County are renters. If you're a homeowner, you're probably stuck as well, particularly if you have only owned a home for a short time. There's a lot of issues there, but as with most of these issues that we talked about with issues seem to impact communities of color far more than communities with a large white population. And the criminal justice system, this is a long-standing issue in the country, and certainly here in South Florida. We talked about some of those numbers. We're going to go through them again. Once again, just going over the main topics that we researched. A lot of discussion took place regarding these. And it's not just the topics in and of themselves, but how the topics relate, the cross-section, the intersection. You really have to be able to understand each of these topics, or these community functions, if you want to look at it that way, in terms of how they relate. Because one impacts the other. You can't really have a discussion about any one without bringing in others at the same time. It's a really important way to think as we go forward when we have these policy discussions. So, once again, the overarching findings, well, as we said earlier, the findings were actually very clear-cut in terms of the levels of disparity and inequities that we found in all these areas that we just discussed. And a lot of these disparities have been in place for some time. As Jermaine said earlier, some have gotten a little bit better, others not so much. So obviously these are some of these discussions that we have to have. The income issue that Jermaine had talked about as well, per capita income, household income, poverty rates. This is where we're seeing some of the largest disparities, despite the fact, as I mentioned earlier, high labor force participation rate. And think about that in this day and age when we have a shortage of labor. We have a shortage of labor. Everybody's crying about labor shortages. And yet, where do we have one of the largest or the highest levels of labor participation? In the Black and Hispanic community, in the immigrant community as well. Very, very interesting discussion. Okay, so let's start with the trend. I will go through some of these fairly quickly. We've highlighted the numbers you have to pay attention to. This is the trend from 2000. This is a little bit longer trend from 2010, 2019. By the way, we'll have 2020 data in about a month. Finally, the 2020 ACS data will be out and we can compare. It'll be the first year we've seen the impacts of COVID on the economy. We're using a lot of different data sources right now to more real-time data to be able to look at some of these issues, but with the census, that 2020 data that will give us another year, and the first year of COVID, to look at some of these disparities and equities to see what's happening. We know, based upon our own research, in terms of data, that it's gotten much worse. It's gotten much worse since the COVID pandemic. The economic impacts of it have severely hurt Black and Hispanic and working households than it has the general population. But there's that trend. There's that trend that I also referenced in terms of this is who we are now, and this is who we become, and this trend is going to continue. We are a majority minority county. Many of our municipalities are. The trend is continuing. Think about that relative to the economy, as I mentioned as well. Labor force participation. We get to age groups who are young, working age groups. Well, young Blacks and young Hispanics. Okay. This particular table brings us a little bit fast forward over the last 5 years. It's just to show you that that trend is continuing. I mentioned, it's not highlighted here, but two or more races, you can see that number has ticked up as well. So we're going to become much more racially diverse county each and every year. We already have become, and we're going to see various other forms of race representation as we go forward as well. And in a lot of ways, we represent what urban America and probably metropolitan America will look a lot more like in the next 5 to 10 years. We looked at the concentrations of both Black and Hispanic populations within Broward County, and also the trend in terms of growth. This particular map here shows you the concentrations of Broward County's Black African American population. You can see that a lot of those concentrations occur in a lot of the more established, older communities of Broward County. You're going to see in the maps that will keep layering this, as I said, go forward, that these are the communities that were established centuries ago in terms of black settlement, going down Dixie Highway corridor all the way west of I-95 to 441. So you're going to find those concentrations in those areas. As far as, I'm sorry, I went too far. As far as Hispanic or Latino population, it's a lot different. Although there is some trends that continue, particularly in some of the older areas of the county. But you can see it's mainly the southwest population growth that we've seen, and that's where the largest concentration is, including a fairly large middle class Hispanic population. Now, the Community Distress Index is an index that the Metropolitan Center corrected soon after COVID hit. If you haven't visited our website, please do. We do have an economic recovery index, which covers Broward County and all of South Florida, in the state, against the state and the United States as well. And if you begin to look at these areas, those dark magenta colors, these are the areas where you have the most distress. And we look at 20 different indicators in terms of housing, poverty, per capita income, all these issues, health coverage, all these types of things. And you can see where the highest distress levels are. Very, very similar to the map that you saw in terms of where the concentration of particularly black populations here in Broward County, but also in Hispanic and new immigrant populations. The economy is so fundamental, as I mentioned earlier. Equity is achieved when those benefits of economic growth are shared. Right now, obviously, we do not see that, not only here in Broward County, but in the country. Economic opportunity is what's fundamental to that. If you were to look at what were the ingredients of economic equity, it was economic equity, opportunity. It's economic stability in terms of having an economy that where distressed communities aren't the most impacted when you have an economic shock like the Great Recession or the pandemic. Economic mobility, where there's generational wealth, generational opportunity. This is what's fundamental to what we talk about economic equity. And we begin to look at occupations and industries. I'm sharing with you right now is just some of the more relevant slides, but obviously all of this is in the reports in more depth. And you can see here that for the most part, Broward County's both black and Hispanic populations were primarily low-wage service sector occupations. A lot of this, of course, in healthcare and retail, and of course, leisure and hospitality. And these are the jobs that pay essentially $15 an hour or less. So if we go back to those poverty numbers and those labor force participation numbers, you can see why this may be happening. We have a lot of working poor, not only here in Broward County, but in South Florida as a whole. These are those labor force participation numbers that we talked about. Really quite striking when you look at the 2019 numbers in terms of both Black, African American, and Hispanic, or Latino relative to the white population. Really significant numbers, and the unemployment rate, though, is actually higher in some of these areas as well, particularly when you get down into the individual communities where you find higher poverty rates. You also find higher unemployment rates, despite the fact that the overall unemployment rate has gone down significantly since about particularly since 2 years ago, but even over the last 7 months or so. Median household income, you can see this across the population group, white alone, Black, African American, and Hispanic. Obviously, far less than the white population of the overall population in both Black and Hispanic households. 71% of the white household among Blacks and 87% of white households among Hispanics. So really far, far less in households of color relative to the larger population. Median household income, the gap that we're seeing in terms of change from 2010 to 2019. You can see those negatives right there, that the gap versus the white median household incomes, nearly 29% among Black African Americans and 26% among Hispanics or Latinos. And once again, a lot of this has to do with wages that have stayed very low, particularly in these lower wage service sector occupations that comprise most of the jobs within communities of color, here not only in Broward County, but elsewhere. The poverty rate is really a concerning issue, especially given that poverty rates in general have gone down over the last 10 years or so, but they still remain stubbornly high in communities of color, particularly Black communities, families with children. This is a real concern because not only are we seeing these poverty rates basically change, we know that a lot of these households, working households, in a lot of cases, these are female-headed households as well. So this creates really, really difficult situations for many of these families and households when you're living in poverty, you're working, and yet obviously it's really, really hard to get ahead. If the children living in poverty, this is a trend that we've seen for some time now. And despite this, I have to say it because it's something that we find very disturbing at the Metropolitan Center. We were at record low unemployment before COVID hit, and we were at record employment, total employment, and yet these poverty rates hardly budged. So we had plenty of jobs, plenty of jobs to go around, but yet these poverty rates hardly budge, and obviously they've gotten a lot worse since COVID. Public education, really fundamental to our equity study. Public education, and when we talk about equity in terms of public education, we mean that each child receives what they need to develop to their full academic and social potential. There's a definition from the National Equity Project. Is the idea that we are all born essentially equal, but some of us have opportunities where others do not in terms of developing that capacity. So we need to be able to allow all our children to have that level of achievement and create that level of capacity. Equity education is the process of reforming practices, policies, and procedures at the school and district levels to support academic fairness and inclusion and ensure that every child has the resources, the teachers, the interventions, and supports they need to be successful. So it's quite a challenge, and what we're finding, obviously, with the data analysis, that a lot of that is missing based upon the outcomes that we have. Now, when we start to look at the school system, we begin to see that our school system reflects our population changes that we've seen, more so than even some of the other demographic numbers. So, but we do see that in comparison here, I guess particularly among white students, what we're seeing is that with the Fsa scores, as we mentioned earlier, here's those numbers that I was just mentioning, but really, really interesting to see that racial composition of our schools really reflecting this demographic shift that we've been talking about all morning. Here's that first indicator that I mentioned, the Fsa scores, obviously from grade 3 all the way up to grade 10. You can just see those disparities there between white, Hispanic, and Black, particularly among Blacks, but certainly Hispanics obviously not scoring nearly as high as white students, but among Black students in the 3rd grade all the way to 10th grade, we're seeing scores far below the white population of students here in Broward County. Really significant finding here. Educational attainment by race. Now, this is your 25 and over population here in Broward County. These numbers are still not good, despite a lot of programs and other things that have been put in place. Educational attainment continues to be a real issue, and you can see where, based on those FSA scores, we have a problem down the road as well, because this is factoring 25 and older, and we have kids in high school and elementary school not doing well on FSA scores. They are the next generation. So how are we going to change these numbers down the road? These are really, really disturbing numbers. Dropout rates, graduation rates, obviously real disparities here, particularly among Black and African American children in our schools. Suspensions, really concerning here as well. In the 2018-2019 school year, Black and Hispanic suspensions made up 85% of all suspensions. 85% of all suspensions were Black and Hispanic children. Public health, another critical issue where we found significant disparities between Black, Hispanic, and white population. How we define that? Well, the National Reach Coalition, we like their definition. Equitable health care means that all individuals have access to affordable, high-quality, culturally and linguistically appropriate care in a timely manner. This includes health care quality, patient education and empowerment, health care infrastructure, health care policy, and program administration. It's a lot to ask, but obviously it's something that's urgently required. We mentioned the uninsured earlier today. You can see these numbers, quite disturbing when you compare both Black and Hispanic households, populations, I should say, to white households, and obviously this creates a lot of stress, and we've seen a lot of this play out since the COVID pandemic. Mortality rates, I think this is probably one of the more disturbing or concerning findings. You can see the numbers here in terms of infant mortality rates. We compare white, Black, and Hispanic residents here in Broward to the state of Florida overall. You can see that number going across, but these numbers are, I think if we're looking at disparity, there's no greater example of disparity in Broward County than in infant mortality. Housing numbers, equitable housing has been a big issue in Broward County and South Florida for a long time. It's only gotten worse, of course, since Broward. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this only because I think it's something we all know. We just added to that. But I think going forward, some of the biggest issues in terms of equity, in terms of housing, is going to be home ownership. Renting is so difficult, so unaffordable, and we're seeing the impacts of being a renter in South Florida right now, being displaced, being evicted in a de facto kind of way, and obviously these rents are going up quite a bit over the past year or so, and probably continue to do so given the shortage of housing. But what we really want to be able to do is build home ownership opportunities, because this is where you build the equity, and this is where you build a lot of the economic opportunity. And yet, at the same time, what we're finding is that a lot of the majority of households, whether they be renters in the Black community or the Hispanic community, are not in a position to buy. And there's different reasons for that. Obviously, income is one, but the other one is lack of access to capital. And lending, when we begin to look at lending activity, we can go deep into this, but we won't have time today, but we have that lending activity is still a big issue. Redlining is supposed to be illegal, but we certainly see evidence of it, and other discriminatory lending practices, fair housing issues that still play out here in South Florida and right here in Broward County. And it does, and it's not just among the Black community. You see here, we look at home purchase loans, high cost purchase loans. You can see where actually Hispanic or Latino have the highest percentage of high cost purchase loans. So this is a big issue that needs to be looked at much more deeply if we're going to create any level of equity in housing, particularly in home ownership, which is certainly needs to be a goal of going forward. Criminal justice and safety. This is a big issue, of course. The opportunity agenda has a great definition for this. An equitable criminal justice system should ensure that all individuals feel safe and secure in their communities and be administered in a fair and just manner with a commitment to equal treatment and accountability. Now, overall, we know that incarcerations among Black and Hispanics is much, much higher among whites. This is a national issue, it's a Florida issue. But we get to also look at other indicators in terms of, in this case, juvenile arrest. We can see these numbers here that, once again, really, really high disparities or inequities within our criminal justice system. The good news is that arrests have gone down for the most part. Particularly violent crimes have gone down. But as far as juvenile arrests, began looking at the communities, and now we go back to those earlier maps, we saw those concentrations, right? Those concentrations not only of Black populations and Hispanic populations, but also the most distressed communities within Broward County. You begin to see those same zip codes showing up on this map in terms of the number of juvenile arrests in 2019. Among Hispanics, some of those same zip codes, and also a little bit further down into South Broward, but once again, you see an overlap there in terms of juvenile arrests with both Hispanic and Black communities in Central Broward. And a lot of that has to do, obviously, with communities that are poor, probably communities that have other social issues. So obviously, that's a big concern as well. Voter engagement, as we mentioned this morning, this was really good news in terms of what we're seeing in terms of voter turnout. Since 2008, Broward County is doing just a fantastic job in this regard in terms of voter turnout within the Black and Hispanic communities. The problem here isn't voter turnout, it's what we see coming down the road. The challenge, of course, will be voter suppression issues that we'll be dealing with this year. Hopefully, Broward County can deal with it. I think we have trust in the county local election system, hopefully, and other local election systems at the county level to deal with Senate Bill 90, which is obviously under legal assault right now. Anyway, so with as far as the path forward, we need to be. This is the beginning. This is the kickoff. This is not. This rollout has to continue starting today. It's a process that will be ramped up in the weeks ahead. A lot of dissemination of information, which the Urban League and Hispanic Union have done a great job on. But we'll have to have more of these discussions, more dialogue. We'll need to be able to start to talk about solutions using these analytics under these various topics as our basis for discussion. You know, what do we have in place? What are our challenges? What should be our direction on some of these issues? Taking in best practice, taking in other things that perhaps are already in place but maybe aren't getting sufficient support for. And then ultimately, though, we have to really create this new level of community level of participation, which Jermaine introduced to us today. We'll have these opportunities to create this public square, so to speak, where we can actually have these kinds of dialogues, these conversations on these very issues, so that we can make these meaningful changes in the near future, and not wait until the next round of data comes around. We certainly have sufficient data right now, analytics, and the leadership and support to be able to take these issues on. We need all of you to be part of that. So with that, thank you.
Oh, wow. Thank you, Dr. Moran. You have really shared, some profound findings with all of us. I think that is vital for the community and all the stakeholders in the room that we spend some time unpacking some of those key areas of the research. I want really fast, though, to tell you that the urban leader and Hispanic community are very proud of the amazing work that some institutions already started, around racial equity and social justice, and to name a few. They worked at CSC in partnership with Broward County School Board and the Department of Health are doing around educating all of us about these issues. I think that that's extremely important. There will not be change unless we are all educated on the subject. The private sector, I'm extremely proud that actually the Prosperity Partnership decided to create another pillar, racial justice and social justice, and it's exciting to know that we will have the opportunity to educate, the corporate leaders moving forward, and of course, the new task force created by also Broward County. Just to name a few, there is so much work already happening, which I think that is a fantastic foundation, for the work that we believe has to have to be done moving forward. I will try to be fast because, time is going pretty fast. So, Dr. Moran, would you please tell us more about the cycles of poverty that exist for Hispanics and Blacks in Broward County?
Sorry about that. What specific policies?
The cycles of poverty.
Well, I think the policies that we need to be looking at going forward need to link all these topics really together. We need to understand how one impacts the other, how living in poverty impacts your ability to have good health, and have good health. How does that impact, obviously, your living environment? So when we begin to think about policies, we really need to connect each of these policies, because that's how we make more meaningful change. We can't operate in a silo, which oftentimes we do, from both a policy and from a program perspective. So it's going to take all of us thinking outside only particular areas to think in terms of how all these topics relate, and how we can put together policies that not only improve, say health outcomes, but maybe would also at the same time help our housing outcomes as well.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we have talked about together over the months is this idea. We talked about it in the press conference, that each of these data points are people, and it's really easy to get caught up with flipping through charts and the like. But I really want to make sure that we are looking at these numbers in a way that reflect the people, the families that we serve. In the presentation, we spoke to the labor force participation rate. And that struck me when we presented that, because very honestly, I don't think that the general populace in Broward thinks that the working population is Black and brown. I think that folks have a different thought process of who works in Broward and who doesn't. Can you speak a little bit to the impact that the labor force participation rate and the understanding of that by our employers in community, what that data point means to them?
Yeah, it's a real disconnect, and I can't think of a better time to have this discussion with businesses and policy makers making a big deal out of the shortage of labor, And here we are in a situation where we're showing labor force participation rates much higher than not only the white labor participation rate, but way above national averages. And to your first point, Jermaine, all we have to do is go into a public supermarket, go through a McDonald's line, get your food from a fast food, and who's serving you your food. Think about that. Almost anything you do from a service perspective, healthcare. I was in a hospital not too long ago, and I actually heard these young African-American nurses saying how stressed they were because they were short on help themselves. But look around, every single nurse was African-American. I mean, so we have to start thinking like that this population of workers that we have in Broward County, whether it be in healthcare, or whether it be in retail, whether it be leisure and hospitality, this population is so essential, and at the same time, it's who we are, and it's changing all the time because we've seen the numbers in terms of what population is growing. And as I mentioned earlier, it's in those age groups too. It's one of the reasons we have such a high labor force participation rate is when you begin to look at the ages, 20 to 45, that's the fastest growing population group. And guess what? That's both Black and Hispanic.
Thank you. We often talk and have conversations about closing the racial wealth gap. And most of us know that actually the best way to do it is by home ownership and business ownership. So going back to the housing, affordable housing, the report found higher levels of cost burden and overall housing distress in less affluent Hispanic and Black communities. According to the 2018 Broward County Affordable Housing Assessment, almost 54% of Broward County households are cost burden, which makes Broward County one of the most unaffordable places to live in the U.S. I don't think that I have to tell you that you already know. Dr. Moran, please provide more insight into the affordable housing in Broward County for Hispanic and Black communities.
Well, as I said, we could go on and on about this one because it's gotten so much worse since COVID and with this dynamic of housing investment that's occurred in the last 18 months. But we were tracking this even before this latest housing boom that has been about 18 months, going on about 18 months now. And we were already finding that those cost burden percentages had risen, particularly among the severely cost burden, those paying in excess of 50 cents on every dollar for housing. That had increased about 30%. 30% within the first 6 months after COVID hit. And where are those communities? Well, we showed them those communities of high distress, mainly Black and Hispanic communities. So the housing issue it's an absolute crisis. And once again, it's impacting Black and Hispanic, of course, Hispanic populations far greater. A lot of our policies are going to have to deal with that going forward. Because it's not going to improve them.
So I know that we want to definitely get to the path forward and what that looks like. And I know some of you might have some questions in the room. So I'd like to share that probably one that is the most personal to me, all of it is. But if we went back, when someone is in the report, but when we talk about people, right, and putting faces to the data, if our data related to maternal health in terms of preterm births went back to 2007, I'm in that data number. So here it is, you have an individual who had a child before, a healthy son. Definitely, I was at that time the president and CEO of the Urban League, very well connected, resources, family supports and the like, but I found myself in that number, right? So I want to leave at least with the path forward from an Urban League perspective. Let's not forget the people. Let's not forget that every action or inaction that we choose at this point, knowing is half the battle, right? Being aware. And Hispanic Unity and the Urban League wanted to put these data points in front of you. But let these spaces be real to you. We got to get outside of our proverbial boxes and really get to touching the people who this data is about. Some of us might be in the room today if you tell your whole story and not just part of the story, right? And then the second point, in terms of the path forward, is this idea of empowering, sharing power, and building power. We cannot be the individuals that are the gatekeepers. We cannot keep perpetuating systems that allow for inequality to occur because it works for us. And we have to get real with that conversation. Because these 6 areas that we have here, if it was just one bar, we would just walk around it. If there were 2 bars, say it was education and health, right? Felipe will just, squeeze our way through it. That's not the challenge. The challenge for Black and brown families is that all these bars are interconnected. Criminal justice, poverty, economics, jobs, you listed. And now what we have is a cage where people can see opportunity, but they are bounded by all of these inequities that they can see it, but because the cage is around them, they cannot get to it. And I will tell you there is nothing worse than seeing opportunity and not being able to touch it. And that is where we come in. And that's where this path forward comes in. That it is not about one organization, it's about all of us together, choosing a common agenda with communication that is ongoing, with metrics that we agree to, and being willing to hold each other accountable. So Felipe, I don't know, what do you think? Do you think we have a path forward here?
I'm so glad that 2 agencies are doing this work together because we have so much in common, shared values. But I totally agree. I think that our job moving forward is to continue expanding, number 1, the education component, is making sure people become aware of what's going on. And I'm not talking about leadership, I'm talking about everyone. Everywhere I go, including those that are close to me, whether are family members or friends, they still believe there is no racial equity issues. So there is so much work that we still have to do. And the second step that I really believe we have to focus on moving forward is make sure that those that are educated now care enough about the issue so we can start talking about solutions. And what I envision is that when it comes time for brainstorming ideas and solutions, is that the faces in this room are not the only ones around the table. That actually are the community members, that are helping us make those decisions, or making those decisions for themselves, and we're just empowering them and giving them the resources so they can make their American dream, a reality. So that's what I envision moving forward, Dr. Germain and Smith, and looking forward to working with you and all the stakeholders, on solutions that actually change the lives of the communities we serve.
Agreed. Snap for that. That's awesome. So I think I'm looking at my team or our teams. We really want to thank the Hispanic Unity of Florida's team, the Urban League of Broward County's team for working behind the scenes, working together to make this happen. The CEOs love you throughout the weekend. We love you a lot.
If I may add to that, many of you know that Urban League of Broward County Hispanic Unity of Florida have worked on so many projects over the last 20 years, so many, just to name a few, Center for Working Families and EITC, the Free Tax Preparation Program, and IDA, and many more. This one got us way closer together. And extremely pleased and proud of Urban League, staff and Hispanic Unity as well. I mean, you guys did an amazing job putting up with Jeremy and me, And last thing that I have to say, and I will be, I have to say this because I know someone is listening. Hopefully you are there, Josie. You got us at this point. Thank you.
I think we all had to take a deep breath on that. She was so kind sending us both of you this morning. But that's the commitment. Are there any burning questions that you have for Dr. Murray? Because we're off stage right, left. Any burning questions that anybody might have as we wrap up?
Can we ask everyone to stand into the mic? There's a mic that our audience.
Good afternoon, my brothers and sisters. My name is Steve Sanchez. I'm with the South Florida AFL-CIO and Vice President LACNA, the Labor Council for Latin American Advancement. My question here is on the title of this forum where we had Blacks, Hispanics, and immigrants. And what are we defining as immigrants in this forum?
That's a good point. I think, Dr. Murray, you want to take that one?
Well, we're talking two levels of immigrants. Two levels of immigrants, those who are naturalized and those who aren't. And we were able to provide analysis of both those immigrants. We didn't provide on some of the presentation today, but in the reports we have a lot of information on the breakout of both naturalized and non-naturalized, non-citizens. Yeah.
So we're talking about undocumented immigrants in our report.
Yeah, non-citizens.
Thank you.
Just, I always want to make a comment, when we talk about undocumented immigrants. You want to know that some of these findings are actually impacting documented immigrants like myself. So when we talk about disparities in Broward County, we're not talking about undocumented immigrants. We're talking about all immigrants. The ones that come to Hispanic community are ready to work tomorrow, right? Legally speaking. They can't because they lack the language, because they don't have access to higher ed, programs, and many other reasons. Just want to put that out there because the last thing that I want everyone, to live, with today is thinking that these issues are only impacting those that are undocumented. That's not the case.
That's a good point. One or two last questions. So if you're listening to us, you can download these reports from both organizations' websites. We also realize that in some venues or some organizations may want a deeper dive related to this data, whether it's with your board of directors or if you have family groups that you work with, and we are open to coming and doing that, as well as the opportunity to be able to look at entities. For example, we mentioned the Prosperity Partnership that have very specific race equity groups. So the chambers have race equity groups, or within your organizations that you might have that. Let's get down into this information in a way that makes sense for your group, so that we can then be able to lift up what we're doing here. So with Healthy Start Coalition, they've already been doing work in this area. I think one of the things that is really important to both of us is to recognize that there are things that have worked, and how do we uplift that? And how do we memorialize that? And how do we document that for future generations to know? And then also areas where we need to put policy together so that you don't have to call us. You can click a button and know these are the policy recommendations coming from Healthy Start related to the maternal health, so that we begin to democratize the way in which we are able to move forward our community. But it's going to take all of us. We're going to stay on this wall, so I'm going to do something with you. If you have a neighbor to your right, look to your right. Your neighbor to the right, look to a neighbor. If you're watching us online or Facebook, look at somebody. It is not your fault Now look at us. Take a deep breath. Look to the other side of the same person. Just us. But it is our problem. It is our problem. Thank you so much for joining us